Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm digging into the lore of A Nightmare on Elm Street. And the reason why I'm doing this here instead of on Horror Trans is because I've already talked about the Nightmare on Elm Street movies on Horror Trans, and this is going to be more like a lore video. And I don't know if this is going to be a long one or not. Because I'm calling it a deep dive. So Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite movie of all time. The original 1984 Wes Craven, Robert Englund flick. Yeah, that one with Johnny Depp. So, the backstory. So there's a lot in the Nightmare on Elm Street backstory, but the reason why I want to do this lore video is because there are two things that came to my attention recently that I had never acknowledged or had never really considered before that I really want to unpack, but I also want to dig into the lore as a whole. So, essentially, a young woman by the name of Amanda Krueger was a nun working at a mental asylum, an insane asylum, and somehow she got locked in the room where they kept the criminally insane, and was raped repeatedly by hundreds of men, and was impregnated, and her child became Freddy Krueger. Freddy Krueger was an orphan, essentially, because she couldn't raise him because she was a nun. And so he went through foster homes and things of that sort. Eventually, he becomes a serial killer. And the court case fucks up, and somehow he's freed on a technicality. As a result of this, the parents of the murdered kids, and this is important, this is why I wanted to talk about this, the parents of the murdered kids hunted him down and burned him alive, burned him to death. And then sometime later, he comes back as a spirit, we'll say, in the dreams of teenagers, and he kills them in their dreams. And if you die in the dream, you die for real. But you don't just die. He gets to keep your soul. So, that's the gist of it. Now, movie to movie, the lore gets a little bit deeper than that. We discover that Freddy Krueger has limits to who he can kill. He can only kill the kids of the people who killed him. And so he needs outside assistance in order to get to the kids outside beyond that. And we also learn that he can manipulate reality in the real world as well, as long as somebody's either a dream, or we learn through the remake, in a state of a micro nap, which is not discussed in the original franchise, but it is sort of explained in the remake. And if you retcon it to retroactively apply it to the original franchise, it helps illuminate some of the mysteries and ambiguous inconsistencies in the franchise. But here's the things I wanted to talk about. So let's talk about the parents. So I'm going to paint you a picture. You are a parent. Whatever. You and your spouse have a kid, and you raise this kid up to about 7 or 8 years old. We'll say 8. just to make it easy. One day, your child, we'll say daughter in this case, because most of his victims were female. He killed some male children as well, but they were mostly female. Your daughter disappears one day, and other neighborhood kids start disappearing. And sometime later, they find her body, or what's left of her body, her torched bones. And you're devastated. You're crushed. You're just, as a parent, you're devastated, right? So, as a parent, you would presumably be obsessed with that child that you lost. You would have photographs of that child in your house. You would regularly go to the cemetery to commemorate that child. You may or may not celebrate that child's birthday every year, as a coping mechanism and a way of remembrance, things like that. You're going to acknowledge the existence of that child. Unless you're in these movies, right? Well, Nancy Thompson is the survivor of the first film. Nancy Thompson's parents, Donald Thompson and Marge Thompson, were among the mob that killed Freddy Krueger. It is, and so are the other kids that are killed in this movie. Johnny Depp, Amanda Weiss, the other kid, all the kids that are being killed in this first movie, their parents were part of the mob. So, the parents who are part of the mob were not random parents. They were parents of the murdered kids. And this is why I wanted to talk about this. Because this means that Marge and Donald, presumably, we can say with, I would say, 80% certainty, had a child that was murdered by Freddy Krueger. And then, after they mourned the loss of that child, they gave birth to Nancy, that child's younger sister. And then they, either through their grief or guilt or whatever, separated. Because they are separated. They don't say divorced, but we do know they are separated in that first movie. So we'll say separated for now, because we can't definitively say divorced, but we can say separated. And Nancy grows up to a teenager, presumably 16 or 17, thereabouts. She's still in high school, so we'll say thereabouts. And she starts having nightmares about the man who murdered your daughter. And the parents act like she's crazy. They just sweep it under the rug. And this goes on for several movies. The last of the Elm Street kids die in Nightmare on Elm Street 4, the Dream Master. This would be Joey, Kincaid, and Kristen. Okay. Here's what makes this fishy for me. This means that these kids, Kristen's mom, this means Kristen had a younger brother or sister that died. This means that Kincaid had a younger brother or sister that died, etc. This means that all of these kids, Glenn, Rod, Tina, the kids from Dream Warriors, they all had brothers or sisters who died. We know from the conversation that takes place in Dream Warriors on Nightmare on Elm Street 3 that the kids didn't know about Freddy Krueger. And they didn't know about their parents killing Freddy Krueger. Now, Freddy Krueger would have been a well publicized. This was in the newspapers, and it was well televised, like she said. Marge says the judge got famous, etc. So this was a well-publicized trial. We know this because there are multiple newspaper clippings and subsequent films. But we know that the town people have gone out of their way to bury this. We know this because in Nightmare on Elm Street 5, none of the adults act like they've ever heard of Freddy Krueger. And the other kids, the teenagers in town, have never heard of Freddy Krueger. And Mark has to go digging up old newspaper clippings to research Freddy Krueger. Okay, so we know that. But here's the thing. Let's go back to where I started with this. You are a parent. You have a 8-year-old daughter, we'll say Tiffany. And Tiffany's murdered by Freddy Krueger. And a year or two go by. You've mourned Tiffany. And you give birth to, we'll say Joey. We'll use Joey as this example. And 16 years later, Joey starts having nightmares about the man who killed Tiffany. Okay. Even if you as a parent are not going to tell Joey that you joined a mob and established vigilante justice and killed Freddy Krueger, and you're not going to tell him about the murders, and you're not going to tell him about the trial or anything else, why wouldn't you tell him about his little sister Tiffany? Why wouldn't you? If I was a parent and I had a child that was murdered, I would have pictures of that kid in every room in my house. I would take a framed picture of that kid to bed with me, put it under my pillow, and sleep with it at night. I would not forget about Tiffany if this was my kid. If I was that parent in this scenario. I would not. When Joey was 11, 12 years old, I'm going to sit him down, show him pictures of Tiffany, and say, this is your little sister. And I want you to know everything about her. Her favorite color, her favorite book, her favorite nursery rhyme, her favorite subject in school, every detail. I want you to know everything about her because she would have loved you if she knew you. This doesn't happen in the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. Nancy believes she's an only child and has no knowledge of the mysterious brother or sister of hers that was murdered. None of the kids do. None of the kids in these movies have any... They don't have any knowledge of Freddy Krueger, and they don't have any knowledge of what their parents did. That we can chalk up to... Yeah, it's a dirty little secret you don't talk about. But the fact that they don't talk about their younger siblings is suspicious to me. I promise you, if I was Kristen's mother, the drunken rich bitch that she is, Kristen would still know about her younger brother or sister who died. There's no way I would erase that kid from existence. Get rid of all their pictures and yearbooks and toys and everything else. Their bedroom would be preserved. Their bedroom would be off limits. You don't go into that bedroom. You stay out of that bedroom. We go to the cemetery once a year on her birthday and we have a birthday party. That's what you would do if Freddy Krueger happened in real life. That's what you would do. So I think it's incredibly suspicious that in the lore of these movies, none of these teenagers know about their brothers or sisters that were murdered. I don't buy it. Either this is an incredible fuck up by the filmmakers and a tremendous oversight that they just didn't even think about, or there's something fishy going on. Now, if we fast forward to Freddy vs. Jason, we do discover in the timeline that the police and the adults and the government, the city government, etc., are involved in the cover-up to get rid of Freddy Krueger. They don't want anyone to know about Freddy Krueger. Which means they would presumably not want anyone talking about the past victims and anything else. However, the one kid that we do know in this movie who is aware of Freddy Krueger's existence knows Freddy killed his brother. Okay? So he knows he had a brother killed by Freddy. So there was no cover-up there. They couldn't have if they wanted to. However, there was no evidence of a cover-up prior to that. Not blatant evidence, I should say. Yes, the parents act suspicious of whenever the kids mention Freddy Krueger, because they're either one in denial or they are covering it up, and they're hoping, well, if they don't talk about it, the kids will shut the fuck up and leave it alone. I'm going with they're just in denial, because we don't see any evidence of malice in Donald Thompson. We don't see any evidence of malice in Kristen Parker's mother or any of the other parents. What we see are parents who do not believe their kids are having nightmares that are killing them. Let's talk about Dream Warriors. In Dream Warriors, the doctors gaslight the kids. Not only do they dismiss their nightmare as what it is, they just dismiss it and say, no, it's not killing you, it's all in your imagination. But like Philip said, the fact that all these kids were dreaming about Freddy before they met each other didn't impress the doctors. So if the doctors are just ignorant, their reaction to that would be, well, I mean, dismissive, right? They're doctors. They don't. They're like, it's a coincidence or whatever. It's a shared hallucination. You know, you were having nightmares before you came here, and then when you came here, after you started sharing your nightmares with your friends, then you all formed this group hypnosis or whatever, psychosis or whatever. Unless the doctors are involved in the cover-up. Now, we have Dr. Sims, and Dr. Sims is a bitch. We can't deny that. But I don't see any actual malice in her intentions. I see her as a doctor who is a doctor of science and does not believe in the supernatural. And so to her, she's not even going to entertain the notion that these dreams are connected. So she's going to dismiss any anecdotal evidence that might suggest there's some truth to the supernatural element of these dreams. Not necessarily a cover-up. But the point I'm making is these kids would have known they had a brother or sister that was murdered by Freddy Krueger. They may not have known his name. They may not have known his story or anything else. But I'm calling bullshit on that as well, because in A Nightmare on Elm Street 1, Tina says, it reminded me of that jump rope song, 1, 2, Freddy's Coming for You. So we know that the lore of the town, this serial killer who comes for the boogeyman will get you, you know. And that's where you get the song 1, 2, he's coming for you, 3, 4, lock your door, 5, 6, grab your crucifix, 7, 8, stay up late, 9, 10, never sleep again. Okay, that's the jump rope song. However, let's look at that jump rope song, because this is the lore this is the next piece of the lore I want to jump into, because Tina brought it up. And it is used in the first movie. 1, 2, Freddy's Coming for You tells me that it isn't the boogeyman. These kids know, either through rumors or school, they're taught town history, that a serial killer named Freddy Krueger used to abduct children and murder them. So these kids would know Freddy Krueger exists. Presumably. 3, 4, you better lock your door. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. Grab your crucifix. That's a religious undertone. They're suggesting here that God may help you. 7, 8, you better stay up late. 9, 10, never sleep again. Okay, this makes sense in the context of the film, A Nightmare on Elm Street, a dream demon possessing people's dreams and killing them. But this doesn't make sense in the context of a nursery rhyme that parents teach their kids to scare them away from strangers, which is essentially what the Freddy's Coming For You nursery rhyme would have been, as Tina described it to Nancy, based on the reference she made. So, again, we have either evidence of negligence by the filmmakers or evidence of a cover-up by the adults. I'm going to call negligence by the filmmakers, because if you're telling your kids, or your kids are hearing the story about Freddy Krueger, and you're making up this nursery rhyme, this 1, 2, Freddy's Coming For You nursery rhyme, as a cautionary tale that kids are, this jump rope song kids are saying. There's some urban, let's call it, at this point we'll call it an urban legend. The kids either don't believe it because it's an urban legend and they're like, oh, it's just a story parents tell kids to scare us, or like alternatively they do believe it because why would parents lie to us? Either or, they would know 1, 2 Freddy's Coming For You. They would know who Freddy is, who that Freddy references. So when Nancy is shocked to learn of the existence of a serial killer named Freddy Krueger, this doesn't make sense because Nancy acknowledged her foreknowledge of the nursery rhyme when Tina referenced it. Nancy didn't say, what are you talking about? Or I've never heard of that nursery rhyme, or anything of the sort. She went along with it. She's like, oh, yeah, okay. Because Tina says, it reminds me of that nursery rhyme, 1, 2, Freddy's Coming For You. And Nancy's reaction is, yeah, that's what my dream reminded me of too. So Nancy would have known that there was a boogeyman by the name of Freddy, and would have known something about the urban legend. Something. However, let's fast forward to part 3 and 4 and 5. Let's look at part 3, the Dream Warriors. Will says when he hears that his parents murdered this guy named Freddy Krueger, blah, 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 he says, Mom and Dad, they never said anything. He's in total disbelief. Right? And when Nancy says his name is Freddy Krueger. He was a child murderer who these kids are learning about this lore for the first time. They're not hearing an urban legend that they already are familiar with being confirmed as true. They're hearing this story that they have never heard of or encountered before, even though they all hear the nursery rhyme in their dreams, as evidenced by the fact that Kristen was saying it when Nancy walked in. And when they said, what's the nursery rhyme? Nancy said, it's something that the kids say to keep the boogeyman away. Again, referencing the urban legend, boogeyman. So, the teenagers should have known a boogeyman named Freddy Krueger was attached to an urban legend in their town that is told through a jump rope song. 9, 10, never sleep again. Now, this could be a reference to the boogeyman's going to get you, so you need to stay up late so he doesn't get you. Possibly. I've always took it as never sleep again, because if you do, Freddy Krueger will kill you. So, I'm not going to call this a whole definitively, because it's possible the other meaning could still apply. So I'll allow it for now. However, as previously stated, we do have the parents completely erasing the existence of their kids and all references to their kids. It is said multiple times throughout the franchise that Freddy Krueger killed somewhere between 20 to 30 kids in the neighborhood. You wouldn't just erase that many kids. There would be memorials to these kids in the school. There would be a wall of the victims in the school, but there isn't. Again, so this is suggestive evidence of of the cover. Now let's dig a little deeper to something I just discovered recently. In A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I'm not gonna look up the exact specifics, but in A Nightmare on Elm Street 1984, Rod Lane is driving around in a Cadillac, a red Cadillac. This is the exact same red Cadillac that we find in A Nightmare in the junkyard in A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, that contains Freddy Krueger's bones in the trunk of the car. When I say the exact same Cadillac, I don't mean it's two cars from the same year with the same coat of paint. I mean it is the literal exact car. The filmmakers used the same literal exact car for both movies. So, this opens up two possibilities for the lore. So we'll go down each path. Possibility number one. The filmmakers fucked up. This is easy to dismiss, right? They just wanted to use the car again because they liked it. From a lore perspective, there's really nothing to uncover. You know, it's just a fuck up, you know. Presumably, hypothetically, and now I believe it was said somewhere, I read online that this was Freddy Krueger's actual car, but I don't remember this being mentioned in any of the movies, and I don't know if this was referenced or mentioned in the TV series or not, or in any of the novelizations or not. So I'm going to say maybe, maybe not, but I'll go with either way. So let's assume this was Freddy Krueger's actual literal car. Okay, in 1968, Freddy Krueger has a trial. Freddy Krueger is killed by the parents, and his bones are placed in the trunk of his Cadillac. And the police and the mob bury that Cadillac in the junkyard where no one will find it. Until 1987, when they have to dig up his bones to lay him to rest. Which is like 20-something years later. Oh. 19 years later, or something like that. Let's back it up. Same scenario. This is just some random car that they put Freddy's bones in for whatever reason, because either they liked it or whatever. Again, nothing you haven't considered before. Okay, there's nothing to uncover here. However, if you consider that this is the original car from 1984 that was used in 1987 in both films, this opens up a lore possibility. So, let's hypothesize for a second. Freddy Krueger is killed in 1968, and his car is impounded by the police. And the police hide his bone, or whoever, hide his bones wherever they hide them. We'll just say they bury his bones, or they put his bones in somebody's basement somewhere, or whatever. Freddy's car is sold at auction. It ends up in the hands of Rod Lane. This opens up two possibilities, but we'll go down the path. It ends up in the hands of Rod Lane. Because this was Freddy's personal car, his spirit, having an attachment to this car, uses this as an opportunity, a gateway, to begin haunting the kids who riding around in this car. So that's why he picks these four to be his first victims when he comes back, instead of Kristen, Parker, and, Kincaid, etc. Because he goes after those kids later. He starts with Nancy and her friends, and then he goes after the other kids one by one. But they're all connected. They're all Elm Street kids. So they're all the same. Freddy could have gone after any of the Elm Street kids in any order. Why did he pick these four kids? Why did he go after Tina first? What made Tina stand out? What made her special? So, continuing this train of thought, Freddy Krueger's car, sold at police auction, ends up in the hands of Rod Lane. Rod and his friends are driving around in this car, and Freddy's ghost decides that this is the time to haunt these kids, because this gives him the energy to enter their dreams and start haunting them. They die, one by one. Tina first, then Rod, then Glenn, and then Nancy escapes. And then Marge dies. So, Nancy goes off to college and pursues a degree in, dream psychology or whatever. And Donald ends up losing his job at the police force and becoming a security guard. We see this in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. He's a security guard. He's not a cop anymore. And then Donald takes that car. He's like, well, because Rod dies. He doesn't, so he's now in possession of the car. Again, it's police impound. It's police evidence. The car of a suspected murderer who presumably killed himself in the jail cell, further cementing his guilt. So now they have presumably they would have another police auction. Except instead they decide this is where they're going to bury the car, in the junkyard, instead of because it's in the impound. They put it in the junkyard instead and bury the bones there, because they figure this is a good time to get rid of those fucking bones. So that's scenario one. This adds to the lore. This opens up a world of possibilities. And would explain why Freddy went after Tina and Rod and Glenn and Nancy instead of Kristen and Joey and Will and Kincaid first. So, let's back it up. Scenario B. Freddy Krueger's killed in 1968. The police impound his car. They have an auction, but they put his bones in the trunk of the car and then they forget about them. They hide them in the trunk of the car and forget about them. They're like, well, whatever. No big deal. And again, Rod Lane comes into possession of Freddy Krueger's car. This is scenario B. And he's driving around in Freddy's car with Freddy's bones in the trunk. Now, the rest of the story is going to be the same as I just told you. Same scenario. Freddy's energy is in the car. It latches onto these kids, kills them. The police take the car and then put it in the junkyard. This seems suspicious. Either scenario seems a little suspicious to me. More likely, what happened is, from a lore perspective, Freddy dies in 1968. The police impound his car, put his bones in the trunk, and bury it in the junkyard and forget about it. And Rod just happens to be driving around an identical car. Same year, make, model, color, everything. Same fucking car. Now, Springwood is not a really big town. We know from the population sign in Freddy's Dead that it had a population of about 15,000 people, give or take, before the murders took place. So, it's not a very big town. Not big enough that two identical cars would exist in the same town. It's not that big. The odds are very slim. So we have to go back to the lore. We have to go back to the lore. Either perspective opens up the door for Freddy to latch onto these kids in Nightmare on Elm Street 1, which would explain why he went after them in the first place. Which works for me. I'm going to go with scenario A, because scenario B is a little flimsier. So scenario A, repeating it, bullet points. Freddy dies in 1968. The police impound his car. It's sold at auction. Rod ends up with it. And Rod and his friends are driving around with Freddy's car. And his spirit his energy is in that car and latches onto these kids. And that's how he's able to enter their dreams. This works for me. This works for me more than it was random. Now, all of the parents, Kristen's parents, Kincaid's parents, Joey's parents, etc., all of them had their hands dirty in Freddy's death. So he could have picked any of them. Now, it's conceivable he would go after Nancy first, because Nancy's parents are the most closest to the case, in that Marge stole Freddy's glove and put it in her furnace in the basement, so Freddy is like, his energy is already in the house. He picked Nancy because, hey, you know what, that's where his glove is. And Donald was presumably perhaps the arresting officer, who may or may not have been the one to fuck up on the search warrant or the investigation or whatever. So it's possible Freddy had intentions of revenge against Donald. You know, like personal. So he targeted Nancy because of that. We do see in the Dream Warriors, Freddy, even though he's only a skeleton, doesn't demonstrate any acknowledgement that he even is aware of or knows who Donald is. He just fucking kills him. It's just another guy in his way, as far as Freddy's concerned. Which means he wouldn't be specifically targeting Nancy, because he, you know, wouldn't know who Nancy is. Again, unless it's because of the glove is in the house. Except he didn't target Nancy first. He targeted Tina first. What's Tina's connection? Well, going back to the newly established lore that I just, proposed, Tina's connection is she's fucking Rod. We can assume she's a teenager. She's a really good-looking, sexually attractive, sexually active teenager with a good-looking, sexually attractive, sexually active male partner. We can assume he's driving around in a Cadillac, which is one of the sexiest cars there are. We can assume that with a high level of certainty, there is a very high probability they had sex in that car at some point. So, let's amend our scenario to Rod comes into possession of the car, and at some point before his fight with Tina, Rod and Tina have sex in the car, which would disturb Freddy's spirit. And now Freddy's spirit is aware of these teenagers. Okay, they're in my car. These 4 kids are driving around in my car, and these 2 boned in my car. So now he has a reason to target them. Based on conversations that take place and reactions throughout the movie, we can assume that all 4 of these teenagers had dreams about Freddy the same night. Based on their conversations, we can assume that was the very first dream any teenager had about Freddy and Springwood. So Tina, Rod, Glenn, and Nancy were the first. They were the first kids, the first Elm Street kids to have Freddy dreams. Now we know in Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy Krueger needed Jesse to help him spread the fear to get access to the other Elm Street kids, even though they were Elm Street kids. He still needed to make them afraid of him so that he would have the power to possess their dreams and target them. Because we know from Freddy vs. Jason, it's the fear that gives him power. So, he had a spiritual connection to these 4 kids. He has an additional connection to Nancy in that she's living in his literal house. We find this out in Freddy's Dead. So, Nancy is living in Freddy's house, and Nancy's mom has Freddy's glove in the basement of Freddy's house. So this gives Freddy's spirit the energy to enter Nancy's dreams. Rod, Tina, Nancy, and Glenn are driving around in Freddy's car. May or may not have his bones in the trunk, either or. So his spirit latches onto them. Rod is dismissive. He doesn't even believe Freddy is. He had a bad dream. He wakes up, it didn't bother him. It was just a bad dream. He shakes it off. Glenn had a bad dream. He shakes it off. Nancy had a bad dream, and she dismisses it. It's just a dream, she says. Tina's the one who takes it to heart. So, here's what I think happened. Freddy died in 1968, and his soul went to hell. After it was given dream powers by the dream demons, the dream people, that we see in Freddy's Dead. But he can't just leave hell willy-nilly. He has to have a hall pass to leave hell. A hell pass, we'll say. You know, he can't just walk out the front gate. It doesn't work that way. You can't just leave hell. It's a prison for damned souls. So, Rod comes into possession. Rod, whose parents were among the mob who murdered Freddy, comes into possession of Freddy's car. And Rod's friends, Tina, Glenn, and Nancy, are driving around in Freddy's car. And this gives Freddy a pass. Freddy goes to Lucifer or whoever, Asmodeus or whoever, and says, these kids are driving around in my car. Let me go back and haunt them, please. And I'll give you their souls. So he makes a deal, whatever. They give him the dream powers, and he goes, and he possesses their dreams. We don't know the details of Nancy's dream, Rod's dream, or Glenn's dream, but we know Freddy was in all of their dreams. Presumably, Nancy didn't remember her dream, because she said, when Tina told her about the fingernails, Nancy said, that's funny you should say that. That reminds me of the dream I had last night. Meaning Nancy had forgotten her dream. So Nancy wasn't afraid of the dream. So Freddy couldn't hurt her. She wasn't afraid enough yet. He couldn't bother her. Glenn was clearly not fazed, and neither was Rod, based on their reactions. But Tina was, for whatever reason. Tina has a crucifix hanging on her wall. So we know Tina is presumably Catholic, or at least Christian, which means she's likely superstitious. So we don't know if the other kids are religious or superstitious at all, because it isn't established at all. There's no hints or suggestions one way or the other. But Tina is. So it's likely, being superstitious, Tina's the one who had the nightmare that it stuck with her. It disturbed her. It bothered her. Now, Tina woke up with her nightgown gashed. So this put a fear in her too. What happened? Did I do that? Did the dream do that? How did my nightgown get gashed? This makes her even more afraid because she can't answer that. And like I said, she's superstitious, so she's afraid now. Afraid enough that Freddy can get her the next night. Because she's legitimately terrified to go to sleep. So much so that she invited Glenn and Nancy over for a slumber party to help her feel safe. And she takes Rod to bed with her, and, they have sex, and then she lies next to her. She feels safe because Rod's there to protect her. But she's still scared. And Freddy gets her anyways. Because Freddy gets her, this makes Nancy afraid enough Freddy can go after her. And Rod, piecing it together and facing his fate, becomes afraid enough Freddy's able to get him. And then later, Glenn finally caves and Freddy's able to get him. And then, of course, Jesse opens the door and lets Freddy loose on the other Elm Street kids because there had to be some sort of connection. Okay, so this is a lot of lore to get into. And I don't want this video to be any longer, so let me know in the comments, what do you think of these theories? Did you ever put this much thought into Nightmare on Elm Street? Are these theories you've never heard before, or is this old news for you? Let me know. Stay cool.